Welcome. In this lecture, we will talk about the various natural hazards and disaster. In this lecture, we would understand what is the difference between human disasters and natural disasters. We would also understand the difference between hazard and disaster. So to begin with, what is disaster? Disaster is anything which is not desirable. So the first key aspect is it is undesirable. It happens outside human control. So there is no human control which can be cited for it. There is no warning, no signal that it is about to occur. It occurs all of the sudden, and then it causes a serious disruption of life. It causes threat to the people, to the infrastructure, create injuries in various forms, and sometimes also brings in emergency situations. So those are called as disasters. These disasters could be natural disasters or human disasters. If I say natural disaster, good example to cite would be earthquake, floods, droughts, landslides, volcanoes. So those are all natural disasters. As mentioned, similar to disaster, they occur all of the sudden without warning. They are on a large scale, widespread, loss of property, loss of social systems and life. Then we do have human disasters. Examples to cite for human disaster would be Bhopal gas tragedy, Chernobyl nuclear leak. Then we also have cases where we talk about release of CFC, global warming, pollution of land, air, soil. All of these are part of human disasters. Now, some of the natural disasters, for example, I take example of landslide. Landslide in itself is a natural disaster. But this natural disaster could be boosted by human interference. How? There can be deforestation, unscientific land use, a lot of construction activities. So indirectly, human beings are responsible for this natural disaster, which is landslide. So even a natural disaster can be actually attributed to human reasons or human conditions that we can understand, right? What has been done to actually understand disasters? So there are various disaster mitigation plans, disaster response system. There is also establishment of National Institute of Disaster Management in India. Then the Earth Summit, Rio de Janeiro Summit in Brazil was one of such moves. Yokohama, the World Conference on Disaster Management is another move. So above all, we can say that these disasters are actually undesirable. But what is a difference from the hazard? Now, hazard is a circumstance, and this circumstance occurs when it causes harm to both people and the region. Now, hazard could be a natural hazard. Previously, hazards and disaster were considered as associated or interchangeable. However, later on it was discovered that the areas that are prone to natural hazards are more vulnerable to disasters. So disaster is ultimately the large scale damage which occurs because of the hazard. Now there are certain characteristics that we identify for a disaster. The first is how strong the disaster is, whether its magnitude, intensity, frequency has increased over the years, the damage it is causing has increased, whether there are significant changes which are taking place, what are the growing concerns, how do people deal with it, the loss it has brought to property and human life. Now all those are some of the important characteristics of disaster. As I mentioned, understanding disaster is important. For example, I take a very simple example. If there are floodplain areas get colonized, large cities develop. Now all these actually happen on the coastline, so the shore is affected, and as a result the coastline or the shore gets vulnerable to cyclonic conditions, to tsunamis, and therefore there is disruption. Now all these are affected by what? They are affected by human interference. So from 1948 onwards we have a list of some of the major disasters worldwide. In Soviet Union, it was the earthquake that affected nearly 1 lakh people. Another important was in East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, in 1970, which was a cyclone that affected nearly 5 lakh people. And earthquake in Iran, which affected 50,000 people, a tsunami in 2004 in Indian Ocean, which brought an end to the lives of nearly 5 lakh people, actually vanishing many of the tribal natives and even the vulnerable tribes of India in the Andaman region. So these disasters and their repercussions need to be understood. So what has happened is the various moves. For example, General Assembly in 1989 formalized the World Conference on Disaster Management, which took place in 1994 in Yokohama, and this was known as the Yokohama Strategy for Action for a Safer World. So Yokohama Strategy for an Action for a Safer World, which was held in 1994 in Japan, was one of the path-breaking events for disaster management. Now, if I want to classify the natural disasters, I can do it as atmospheric, terrestrial, aquatic, and biological. Atmospheric would include cyclone, tornado, droughts, floods, hailstorm, frost, heat waves, cold waves. Terrestrial would include earthquake, volcano, landslide, avalanche. Aquatic would include tides, ocean currents, surge, storm surge, tsunamis. Biological would include infestations by the insects, colonizing by plants and animals, bacterial and viral diseases, and so on. Now, for all these natural disasters, what is important? One is identification. The second is classification of the disaster. So identification of the disaster, classification of the disaster, and dealing with these disasters is important. India is such a vast country in terms of the natural attributes, the biological attributes, so it has a huge vulnerability to natural disasters. As we mentioned in 1994, the World Conference on Disaster Management, which was held in Yokohama in Japan, talked about the Yokohama Strategy and the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction. Now, this was with the motive of plan action for a safer world. Now, when it focused on the term safer world, what was the resolution? That each country would have the responsibility to protect its citizen. So, it's first of all the responsibility of the country. Priority would be given to whom? Priority would be given to developing nations. Right, there would be national capacity building which would be developed, strengthening the regional and the sub-regional networking. For that, capacity building, human capacity building, technology, sharing of technology, and mobilization of resources are some of the key elements that were discussed. And then 1990 to 2000 was declared as the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction. The next is earthquakes. Now, earthquakes are tectonic features which are most unpredictable, highly destructive, and they are also sometimes associated with volcanic eruptions, landslides, subsidence. So, there are various things which they actually attribute to. Now, these earthquakes have been affecting various parts. There are various zones. For example, very high risk zone, high risk zone, medium risk zone, low risk zone, and very low risk zone. Previously there were 5 zones, now there are 4 zones that we divide into. The very high risk zone includes the region of northeast states, the areas of Darbhanga, Aharia in Bihar, Himachal Pradesh, the areas around Dharamshala, in Gujarat the areas around Kutch. In the high risk zone it is Jammu Kashmir, Himachal Pradesh, parts of North Punjab, parts of East Haryana, and then West Uttar Pradesh. So those are some of the areas under high risk. Under low risk, it is mainly the peninsular stable block that occurs. Now what happens? Earthquake causes damage to infrastructure, life, property, communication network, infrastructure. Also, it brings in a break in the socio-cultural ties, right? So there are various effects of earthquake that could be seen on ground, on man-made structures, and on water. So on the man-made structure, obviously there could be cracks, sliding, collapse, and this could lead to chain effect. That means one building tumble down, then all of them nearby to it would tumble down, and that's what is a domino effect. On water, it could lead to tsunamis, waves, storm surge, and again lead to chain effect. On ground, it could affect the settlements, landslide, earth pressure could be affected, and there could be fissures that can be witnessed. So those are some of the key aspects. Now, as you can see, these are the areas which are marked in the dotted are the least concerned areas. The areas here are the most concerned areas, right? And the shaded one are the low risk areas. So the peninsular block is relatively stable. Now, how do we mitigate earthquake is again interesting. To mitigate earthquake, there are various strategies. First is the establishment of monitoring centers. Now, these monitoring centers give a live understanding of the earth waves and the patterns for the same. So GPS is used to monitor the tectonic plates. The next important way to mitigate is to modify the structures of the house. For example, in Japan there are floating houses. That means the structure of the house actually floats with the tectonic plate and therefore protects the house from cracking down. The next is adopting the resistant designs. So either modify the structure or have certain resistant designs or use better quality material. So quality of material for construction purpose is also important. And above all, one very important thing that you can do for mitigation is to prepare a hazard zone map or a vulnerability map, which would help us understand the areas which are highly vulnerable should be considered before. The next is tsunami. What are tsunamis? Tsunamis are huge waves. Now these huge waves are generated in the water. The reason could be an earthquake underground, a volcano beneath the water. So all these leads to huge waves. They are also known as harbor waves or the seismic sea waves. Now seismic because they are generated by earthquake. However, there could be other reasons, other factors that could lead to tsunami. So seismic waves are not one instantaneous vertical waves, but after an initial disturbance, there are series of waves which are generated and they oscillate between the high crest and the low trough. So high crest and the low trough is where they oscillate in between. Now in the shallow areas, what would happen when the water approaches the coast? What would happen? As the water approaches the coast, the wavelength is reduced and the wave height gets increased. It is so high that it could reach up to 15 meters to 50 meters high, and this has been commonly seen in the regions of Japan, Philippines, Alaska. These are some of the areas which are highly vulnerable to tsunami. In 2004, the tsunami that affected the Indian Ocean, specifically the region of Andaman Nicobar Island, was one of the most vulnerable ones, and India itself as a country could not handle it and required international aid and international help. And later India volunteered to join the international tsunami warning system, and that was in line of the 2004 tsunami damage that occurred, which affected a lot of tribes as well, as we already mentioned. The next is tropical cyclone. VD, as we have mentioned, are the areas where you have advanced damage because of cyclone, light damage because of cyclone, but again it is a relatively heavy damage. So wherever you have alphabets written, those are the regions which have a higher damage. Then you have the dotted area, and this is the area where you have minimum risk of cyclone because it is on the leeward side and therefore it is not affected by the cyclones. Now what happens? Cyclone is actually an intense low pressure area which is created. Now this low pressure area which is created attracts the winds from all the sides, which is high pressure. At the center of it is the eye, which is the calm area, and the surrounding areas to the eye are the areas of intense disturbance. The waves or the air rises up and then finally dissipates in the upper atmosphere. So this actually requires a large and a warm moist air parcel, a continuous supply of air warm moist air, continuous supply of air, unstable condition throughout the region, a strong Coriolis force which is required to generate the tropical cyclone. Also, during since India has Arabian Sea at one side, Bay of Bengal and Indian Ocean, India has an ample of cyclones which are generated on both the sides. Usually it originates somewhere around 10 to 15 degree north latitude, and that's during the monsoon season. And in case of other months, for example October, November are the months where Tamil Nadu is the region which is worst affected by cyclonic conditions. Also, cyclone sometimes generates a storm. These storms leads to huge rising waves, and it is also known as the storm surge. It can also lead to strong surface winds which are created, ultimately leading to heavy rainfall in the region. The next is the region of floods. Now, flood region, as you can see, are the regions which are the regions where you have the rivers flowing through, and close to those rivers is the area where flooding occurs. So usually when there is inundation of the land, human settlements are there, the rising water in the channels is not able to spill over, not getting absorbed, and leads to floods. As a result, in urban area we do have flash floods because of the concretization. So there is no seepage of the water, and as a result, with little of rainfall, there is quick accumulation of water which is known as flash floods. Now, when the spilling is not able to be done, or the absorption of the water in the ground does not take place aptly, then there is a situation of flood that occurs, and that is because of the excessive runoff. The capacity of the river channels are met, it cannot go beyond that, and as a result the excess water drains out. What are the reasons which have been cited for the flood conditions? First is the indiscriminate cutting of the forest. So deforestation is one of the major reasons associated to it. Unscientific agricultural practices which has led to the soil quality which is damaged, disturbance of the natural drainage, creation of dams, colonization of the floodplain area, a lot of human settlement. So Rashtriya Baad Ayog has been created, and this Rashtriya Baad Ayog actually talks about the ways to mitigate the flood into certain region. It is also known as the National Flood Commission. Now, what have been the drawbacks of the flood? One is it leads to epidemics with the deposition of water, accumulation of water, waterborne diseases, vector-borne diseases actually rise. So cholera, gastroenteritis, dengue, malaria are some of the diseases which rise. Also, millions of people are rendered homeless, there is loss of electricity, network connectivity goes on, infrastructure gets damaged. So there are numerous disadvantages, but on the other hand we do have a advantage. What is that advantage? The advantage is deposition of the fertile silt. Now this deposition of the fertile silt is actually good for the crop. Majuli is one of the islands which has this fertile soil, and paddy is grown uniquely in this region because of the flood depositions which are there. So that there is where we can say floods are useful. But we have also seen the drawbacks and the benefits of the flood simultaneously in this section. Another important thing is any natural disaster is value neutral by nature. However, for man, we add value to it because we consider this as an undesirable event. For nature, it is not undesirable. For nature, it is something that has to happen just to maintain the balance in the nature, right? So nature does not have value addition to it. It is value neutral for nature, but for human beings, we do associate values to it. The next is drought. Now, drought is where you have shortage of water. Now, this could be due to inadequate rainfall, excessive evaporation, or excessive utilization of groundwater. So under droughts, we talk about 4 types of droughts. What are those? One is the meteorological drought. The next is the agricultural drought, ecological drought, and hydrological drought. Let's understand the difference. Meteorological drought is a region which is marked by prolonged absence of rainfall or uneven distribution over time and space. Agricultural drought is where the soil moisture capacity is not worth it. More than 30% of the gross cropped area is under irrigation. Those are the signs of agricultural drought. Ecological drought is where the productivity in the natural ecosystem falls. Hydrological drought is where there is below normal water availability in the water reservoirs, as simple as that. So those are the four types of droughts that we have understood. Some estimates have said that nearly 19% of the country in terms of geographical area, 12% of the population suffer from drought. If the rainfall is less than 90 millimeters, then it is a case of excessive drought condition. Now what would happen under drought? There would be akal, that is shortage of the food grains. There would be jalkal, that is shortage of water. Trinkal, which is shortage of fodder. Together these three would be known as Trikal, which is considered as a severe form of drought, which is most devastating. It can lead to large scale death of cattle, animals, migration of human from one place to another. It can lead to epidemics because of water scarcity, contamination of water takes place, and also there has to be provisions for safe drinking water which must be provided. Medicines must be provided to victims who are affected by drought conditions. Fodder availability needs to be checked for animals, and also migration needs to be checked. And in the recent studies we have seen in the regions of Latur in Maharashtra, water trains were run during the period of drought. The idea was to bring in drinking water from other regions into that region. So those are some of the important aspects of drought. The next is landslide. Landslide is not that widespread, but yes, it is an important topic that we would discuss here. Now landslide has various vulnerability zones: very high vulnerability, moderate, and others. Now, very high vulnerability are the areas of higher landforms. So, higher Himalayas we can say is the area. All the regions of northeast except the Assam plain are an example of very high vulnerable regions to landslide. Then we have the regions of Himalayas, Andaman Nicobar, and so on for vulnerability. Moderately vulnerable is the central part of India, and other parts where we have very less landslides are the plain areas basically. So landslides, as I mentioned, is relatively small, relatively localized. There could be blocking of a road, blocking of a railway line, blocking of a channel, but it is at a relatively smaller scale. There are various restrictions which come to the construction when there is landslide, restrictions on the agriculture. Specifically in the states of northeast, we have seen that terrace farming should be encouraged in line of the zooming cultivation or the shifting cultivation to protect landslides in those areas. So those are some of the key aspects of landslide. Now under landslide we have covered a separate lecture where we have talked about the flow, the slide, the various ways in which the landslide can take place. The last important aspect is how do we manage disaster. So when we manage disaster, there are a threefold strategy: pre-disaster, post-disaster, and during disaster, right? So post-disaster, the only thing that we can do is rehabilitate people and recover the victims. Pre-disaster, we can talk about generating data, identifying the vulnerable areas, preparing a mitigation plan, and having preventive measures. During a disaster, what can be done is a good rescue and relief operations which can be laid forward, right? So when we are managing disaster, a good example is Disaster Management Bill of 2005. The idea is to define disaster. This bill actually defines disaster as a catastrophic condition which occurs all of the sudden could be because of accident, could be because of negligence, could be because of natural reason, but it affects the life and property. So there is human suffering, there is material suffering that occurs because of the disaster. So minimizing those damages is important, and therefore there are three important steps, which is either pre-disaster, during disaster, or post-disaster management, that we can take into account. For example, if I talk about in a region of cyclone, building of cyclone shelters, dikes, reservoirs, planting in more trees are some of the ways through which you can actually minimize disasters. The similar things are applicable for different segments of disaster. So this was just one segment of disaster that we introduced to you. So if you have any questions regarding this lecture, it was relatively a basic lecture focusing on the fundamentals of what is disaster management, the natural and the man-made or human disasters, the various forms of disasters and how to control those, the mitigation plan, the Yokohama conference, as well as the disaster management bill 2005. If you have any questions, feel free to post those in the comment section. Do follow the links below for more information and handouts. Have a wonderful day ahead.